Welcome to Lecture 7. So now we are more than halfway through the lectures that you'll have to watch. And this is going to be about the changes in the economy and then the changes in democracy that happen because of those economic changes. And we're going to split this into multiple parts because it's a really long subject. Really in the first half, first half of the 1800s, we see a lot of changes happening very quickly in the United States. And we call this era the market revolution. And it is part industrialization, so the Industrial Revolution is included in this, but it's also part westward expansion. And all of it together is driven by the need to be connected to and to be involved in the growing world marketplace. The market revolution, this era, really was kicked off by a series of technological inventions and innovations, especially in transportation and communication. Back during the colonial era, technology had not improved very much. In fact, between the 500s to the 1650s, technology in the West, in Western Europe, and then in the colonies, had actually kind of slid backward, especially technology in transportation. You were using roads and boats in the 1500s that might actually have been slightly worse than you would have had access to 1,000 years before. But then in the late 1600s, we had the scientific revolution. And then we had the Enlightenment, and people were researching and investigating and experimenting, and things started perking up. But during the colonial days, we really didn't see any meaningful changes to shipping or to canals or even to manufacturing, which was mostly still done by hand in the colonial era. Transportation was awful. Most roads were just like rutted pathways through the woods. And apart from the ships sailing up and down the coast, transportation within the United States was extremely difficult. Like entire regions of the country were almost cut off from each other. Transporting farm goods by wagon over just 30 miles of road would cost you as much as putting it on a ship and sending it all the way to England. In 1800, it took 50 days to move goods from Cincinnati, Ohio to New York City. Y'all, it's less than 600 miles from Cincinnati to NYC. Today you can drive it in 11 hours, or less depending on how fast you drive. But back then, you had to put it on a flatboat on the Ohio River, then you had to float it down to the Mississippi River, then down the Mississippi to New Orleans, then put it on a ship and send it all along the Gulf Coast, around Florida, and up the Atlantic. And that was still easier than trying to put it on a wagon and transport it across the mountains. At the beginning of the 1800s, most farm families still produced most of their own needs, made their own clothes, grew their own food. And what they couldn't make themselves, they would usually get by like bartering with neighbors or at local merchants or with craftsmen. But often they didn't use cash money. They usually didn't see much cash money. So they would trade eggs, or they would trade other farm goods, or they would share labor. And farmers that were far away from rivers or cities had a very hard time marketing their crops. So places like upstate New York were still not heavily settled. But then all of a sudden, in the first 50 years of the 1800s, inventions just came one right after another, so quickly that people felt like they couldn't keep up. In some ways, it's almost like how people react to new technology today. Like, my phone is almost 2 years old and I still haven't quite figured out how to use all of the features. Probably never will. And I can't even imagine trying to figure out using whatever the next generation of phone is going to be. And back then, it was steam power. I can't use steam power. I just figured out how to use a water mill. All of a sudden, there were steamboats and canals and railroads and telegraphs, and all of this helped to open new land for white settlement. It lowered the cost of transportation, it lowered the cost of marketing your crops, and Americans kind of felt like They were masters of time and space. Now, the first big advancement in overland transportation, in ground transportation, were these toll roads. The toll roads, or the turnpikes, were usually built by states, sometimes by cities working together. Between 1800 and 1830, New England states alone chartered more than 900 companies to build new roads. In 1806, Congress authorized the construction of what they intended to be a national road, and this is a map of the national road. It took them 7 years to build the road from Cumberland, Maryland, where it originally began, all the way out to Wheeling, West Virginia. That's 110 miles. Took them 7 years. Eventually, the national road will stretch out to Vandalia, Illinois, the center of Illinois here, and then the government will run out of money. Now, two things about toll roads. First of all, they were new, and so they were in fairly good repair. And two, they paid for the construction and the repairs out of those tolls. So, like, if you get on I-44, you have to pay to use those roads. And a lot of people didn't want to do that. I mean, if you're going to Tulsa, sure. But if you're going from, like, Miami to Joplin, are you going to pay, what is it now, $1, just to use that little stretch of toll road before Oklahoma state line comes? Most people aren't going to do that. So they'll, like, go around it. They'll go to Baxter and they'll pick it up there where there's not a toll to pay. And people would do that in the early 1800s too. Sometimes towns or individuals would build what they called shunpikes, these detours, so their town citizens can get around and get to the next town over without having to pay the tolls. So the turnpikes themselves usually didn't turn a profit, and they often barely had enough money to keep in repair. And even on the new roads, you still had to use a horse-drawn wagon, and that is still inefficient. What really made a difference was water transportation. Steamboats and canals made it much cheaper and faster to travel and ship goods. One of the guys messing around with steam engines was this guy, Robert Fulton. He's from Pennsylvania. He'd been experimenting with steam technology while he lived in France for a while, and he even managed to launch a steamboat on the Seine River in Paris. But it wasn't until he sent a steamship down the Hudson River from New York City to Albany that people really sat up and paid attention. Fulton's ship, this one, the Clermont, traveled upriver. It traveled against the current, and that was an awesome thing. Before this, if Americans wanted to ship something along a river, you could mostly just send it downstream. They used flatboats back then. So you'd pile all of your stuff up onto the flatboat here and send it downriver. And when it got to the end of the line, they would usually just break the flatboat up and then sell off the lumber because they couldn't take it back upriver. They couldn't pole it against the current. But now with these steamships, you can. You can ship north along the Hudson. You can ship north along the Mississippi. You can ship really fast across the Great Lakes. You can ship things even faster to and from Europe. The first steamboat hit the Mississippi River in 1811. By 1830, there were 200 of them just on the Mississippi. The spread of canals was also very important. The Erie Canal, this is the Erie Canal here, was completed in 1825. Before the Erie Canal was built, the longest canal in the United States was 28 miles long. The Erie Canal was 363 miles long. It's a massive engineering undertaking. It ran from Buffalo, New York, which sits out on Lake Erie, to Albany, New York, which is on the Hudson River. So now, if you live here along the Great Lakes, you can ship things to the canal, to the start of the canal, and then along the canal, and then down the Hudson to New York City. And almost immediately, as soon as the canal zone opened, settlers started moving into that area. Because if you're a farmer, you want to be near good transportation so you can, sell your crops. If you're a manufacturer, you want the same thing. And if you're just, a regular Joe with a family, you want to be near towns where you can buy nice things. And the canal provided all of that. Buffalo had a population explosion. There were maybe 2,000 people living in Buffalo when the canal was first started. And within 5 years, they had seen a 500% population growth. Cities like Rochester and Syracuse were founded along the canal. And the canal was really important for the growth of New York City. Now, New York had been a substantial port since the 1600s, but it had to compete with all of the other substantial ports, particularly places like Boston. But New York City is the only city that had access, the only port city, that had access to the Erie Canal. And so that meant that New York wasn't just a port to and from Europe. It also became the granary of the entire northeastern part of the continent. It got all of the farm goods of the Old Northwest. And other states went crazy trying to finance and build their own canals to try to compete with New York City, and many of those states will go bankrupt trying to do that. But by the early 1840s, more than 3,000 miles of canal had been built. It created a network, particularly in the north, that linked the Ohio with the Mississippi River to the Atlantic states and drastically reduced the cost of transportation. Now, canals connect existing waterways. Connects lakes to rivers or rivers to rivers. But you need those waterways to be in place first. If you want to head out across the continent where there aren't major waterways, you need something entirely new. The railroad opened up vast new areas of the interior to white settlement. The first commercial railroad was the Baltimore and Ohio. It was started in 1828. 5 years later, we had our first long-distance railroad line. And by 1860, there were 30,000 miles of rail in the United States. The United States had more miles of rail than the rest of the world combined did. Now, the growth of the railroad also led to some new industries, and to some old industries getting bigger, because to run a railroad, you need coal. You need steel, you need sleeper cars, you need nice seats, you need engineers. All of these industries were either founded or grew incredibly during the first half of the 1800s. At the same time, we get better communication, like the telegraph. That made it possible to have almost instant communication across vast distances between like St. Louis and New York City. The telegraph was invented in the 1830s by Samuel Morse. And using Morse code, messages were sent over these electric wires with each letter and number represented by its own little pattern of electric pulses. And by 1860, there are more than 50,000 miles of wire in the United States. Again, mostly in the north. Now that helped to speed up the flow of information, and it was especially great for merchants, especially those merchants moving into the frontier. Say you're a shopkeeper in St. Louis. You have a city that is growing. You have more wealthy people moving into your city, and you want to be able to provide to your wealthy clientele the latest European luxury goods. But how are you going to get those luxury goods to sell to your customers? Do you just send a guy to London and hope for the best? Well, with this telegraph, you can send a guy to London, you can send a guy to Paris, you can send a guy to Moscow, we'll say. And you say, when the market's open on Monday, you wire the prices for these goods. You did it, the Morse code. You wire me back the prices for these goods, and in 15 minutes you can figure out where to get the best price plus shipping and get the stuff that you need. All of these improvements made it possible for more white settlers to move into the new western states. Between 1790 and 1840, About 4.5 million people crossed the Appalachian Mountains here. More people crossed the mountains than the entire nation had when Washington was inaugurated. And most of that migration, the vast majority of it, happened after the end of the War of 1812. Just in the first 6 years after that war ended, 6 new states were added. Alabama, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Mississippi, and Maine, yeah. Now, very few people went west on their own. Mostly they went in groups for support and for safety. And when they'd found a good spot that they all kind of agreed on, then they would cooperate to clear the land, build houses, build barns, start the towns. Now, as the population moved west, the nation's borders expanded. Generally, European Americans didn't actually care who owned the land that they wanted to settle. So they moved to Florida when it was still owned by Spain. They moved to Texas and the Southwest when it belonged to Mexico. They moved to the Oregon Territory when it was still part of British Canada. And then, of course, they just milled all over Indian land. U.S. settlers were fairly confident that their government would protect them no matter where they went. And by and large, they were right. U.S. settlers in Spanish Florida started a rebellion against Spain, and the U.S. government came in and annexed Florida for them. When they start fussing in Texas, the U.S. will take that land for them, too. Now, there were 2 major streams of migration that are happening in the early 1800s, and mostly they are of people who are heading kind of directly west. So we get these 2 new areas of the country, the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest. Now, the Old Northwest, where's my pointer? There it is made up of those territories that will become states under the Northwest ordinances. So Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, this area here. Mostly they're going to be settled by folks from New England who are heading directly west, or from the middle colonies heading directly west, although the southern parts of these 3 states are going to be settled by Southerners heading directly west. Now, the majority of the Old Northwest is going to have a lot of cultural similarities to the old Northeastern states. So you will see civilization kind of like the Puritans had. You will see small towns, you will see public schools, you will see an awful lot of Congregationalist churches, and you'll see a really cohesive society where people kind of, pay a lot of attention to each other, and without breaches of behavior, just like the old Puritans had. Now, the other new region of the country is the Old Southwest, and that's Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, a little bit of Alabama. And that's mostly settled by Southerners who are also heading directly west. And so this territory is going to very much resemble the original Southern territories. They're going to be slave societies dominated by a handful of extremely wealthy planters who have a great deal of power. And we can look at the numbers to get an idea of Western growth. In the 1840 census, we found that 2 out of every 5 Americans lived west of the mountains. In just 20 years, the population of Ohio more than tripled, and by 1850, it was the 3rd largest state in the Union. The leaders of this era, the political leaders, saw their careers influenced by westward movement. Like Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay and many other statesmen may have been born in the East, but they made their mark in politics after moving west. Now, the market revolution also worsened some of the sectional divisions in the country. Already we saw a divide between North and South, and the rise of the Cotton Kingdom made that division even more stark. The early Industrial Revolution centered on mostly cotton textile factories using water-powered machines. But those factories generated an immense demand for cotton. Until the 1790s, marketing cotton was very slow and inefficient because it took a lot of time and a lot of work to prepare it for sale. So you got to separate the cotton from the seeds and the boll, and there's dirt and if you drive across like north central Oklahoma, you can see cotton just growing in the ditches along the side of the road. And if you've never handled raw cotton, and you decide you want to, be very careful because the bolls can get really sharp and cut your hands open. And, it's just inefficient and it's messy and it's a pain in the butt. But in 1793, a slave who belonged to Eli Whitney developed this machine, the cotton gin. And then Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin. The cotton gin is this device made up of rollers on this side, and then brushes over here. And what you would do is you would put the cotton in the bottom of the box and turn the handle and roll it against the brush, and that would take all of the junk out for you. Now, before the cotton gin, some people believed that slavery was maybe on its way out. There's the impact of the Revolution. There is the growth of gradual emancipation in the North, and also people questioned whether slavery was the best economic system. But now there's all this land opening up, and you can plant all of the extremely lucrative cotton that you want because now you have this machine to help you get it prepped. Before the cotton gin, it would take one slave an entire day to prepare 1 pound of cotton for sale. Just using this hand crank first generation cotton gin, one slave can prepare 150 pounds of cotton in a day. And if you get one of those newfangled steam operated cotton gins, one slave can prep 1,000 pounds of cotton in a day. So suddenly it's very cost effective to plant a lot of cotton and to get a lot of slaves out in the field planting and picking, because you only need one guy manning the gin. He can take care of the entire plantation. On average, a planter would get about 530 pounds of cotton per acre. So before the cotton gin, that would take for frickin' ever to get ready for sale. After the gin, it takes less than a day. In 1793, the year that the cotton gin was patented, the U.S. grew 5 million pounds of cotton per year. By 1820, the U.S. is growing 170 million pounds a year. Now, coupled with the rising demand for cotton and the opening of new territory for settlement, the cotton gin revolutionized American slavery. Instead of dying out, it began to expand. In the first decade of the 1800s, cotton plantations spread into the Carolina upcountry. After the War of 1812, slave owners started pouring into the old Southwest here. And as usual, planters monopolized the best land. Poor farmers generally had to make do with the hill country, which had not very good land and was not very accessible for transportation. After the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, after it became illegal to bring new kidnapped people from Africa, planters in this growing new territory had to find their slaves somewhere else. And so a big economy in slave breeding sprang up, particularly in Kentucky and in Western Virginia. We estimate that about 1 million slaves were taken from the older states and moved to the Cotton Kingdom between 1800 and 1860. Some of them traveled with their owners, but most were transported by slave traders and sold at auctions in their new towns. Slave trading became a big southern business in this era. Whereas in the 1600s and 1700s, slave trading had mostly been handled by northern shippers. But now that the shipping is becoming difficult, it becomes more of a southern business. Slaves would sometimes be put on boats in the older states and then moved around the coastline to New Orleans or to Mobile and then marched across the south to their new plantations. But it was much more likely that they would be sold by their owners in their original locations in Charleston or up in Richmond, Virginia, and then force marched all the way overland to the new territory, close to 1,000 miles for some of them. It was not unusual to march a coffle of slaves from Virginia to Louisiana. The coffles, if you've seen that Tarantino movie, Django Unchained, super inaccurate in many ways, obviously, but in like the first 7 minutes of the movie, they have a fairly accurate depiction of a slave coffle. So this would be slaves who are being transported across the South to their new owners, chained at the legs, chained together at the legs and at the neck so that they couldn't fight and run away. White Americans saw westward expansion as freedom. But for Black Americans, it meant having their families broken up and sold off. It meant seeing their communities destroyed. And for many of them, it meant fewer chances for freedom. Like Jefferson had wanted the American farmer to be the symbol of the U.S. and the backbone of the economy. But as the Southern economy expands westward, it's slave-produced cotton, not the products of independent farmers, that become the real foundation of Southern development and the most important U.S. export. Since cotton was produced entirely to sell at market and is not, something you can eat, the South was in some ways the most commercially oriented part of the U.S. But rather than causing economic change, the South's westward expansion just reproduced the same agricultural, slave-based social order that the old states had. The South remained overwhelmingly rural. In 1800, about 80% of Southerners were involved in farm labor. In 1860, about 80% of Southerners were involved in farm labor. The South's transportation and banking are all connected to the plantation economy. They're all geared toward transporting cotton and sometimes other staple crops to market. They're focused on financing the purchase of more land and more slaves. So the South is increasingly involved in the world market, but that involvement is not causing much change at home. In the North, though, it's a very different story. The market revolution and the push west transformed the North into a recognizably modern economy of commercial farms, manufacturing cities, even a growing middle class. As the Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, etc., as that area became more settled, it got drawn into this web of transportation and credit that was controlled by eastern cities. So farmers had to become more involved in the new market economy, kind of whether they liked it or not. Before the market revolution, most farmers would grow what their families needed to eat, maybe a little extra for local sale, and they made most of the goods that they used at home. After the market revolution, more and more family farms are focused on market products, growing more cash crops, in some cases growing only cash crops, and buying the food and the goods that they used to make for themselves. The growing eastern cities, I'm going to restart this map here so you can see the spread. Oops. The growing eastern cities provided a market for these farm products. And those cities would then give credit to the farmers, give loans to the farmers to buy more land, to buy newer equipment. So eastern banks would loan them money to buy land and supplies out here, and then they would take the farm products made out here and use it to feed their workers here. By the 1840s, farmers out here are relying more and more on new farming technology. In the 1840s and 50s, mass-produced fertilizer became available. The steel plow was invented by John Deere in 1837. By the 1840s, that's being mass-produced. Cyrus McCormick invented the horse-drawn reaper in 1831, and the two of those together, the steel plow and the horse-drawn reaper, meant that one farmer by himself can handle oh my God, 10 or 15 times as much land as he used to be able to handle. That is, of course, assuming that he can afford to buy this equipment. Between 1840 and 1860, America's wheat output tripled. But unlike cotton, the majority of the wheat was consumed in the U.S. Wheat pushed westward into the new western states. We see farmers scooching a little further west every year. But from the beginning, cities were an important part of the West. Western cities like Cincinnati, Ohio, and St. Louis stood at the crossroads of regional trade, and they saw extraordinary growth. Cincinnati used to be known as Porkopolis because of its slaughterhouses. Hundreds of thousands of pigs would be butchered there every year and then processed for shipment back east. But the greatest of all the western cities was Chicago, Illinois. In the early 1830s, Chicago was a fort with a little tiny trading post surrounding it. By 1860, thanks to the railroad, Chicago had become the fourth largest city in the country. By the end of the 1800s, it'll be the second largest city. Farmers all over the old Northwest sent their products to Chicago to be gathered and shipped east. Cities saw a dramatic change because of the market revolution. The number of big cities rose tremendously. Although, in fairness, I do have to tell you what counted as a big city back then. The census office defined a big city as a city with more than 5,000 people. But in 1820, we only had 12 cities that counted as big cities. 30 years later, we had 150 cities that could meet that definition. And by the end of the century, they will have to redefine what counts as a big city. They had to move it from 5,000 people to 100,000 people. And by the 1850s, more than 6 million Americans lived in cities. Urban merchants and bankers and master craftsmen tried to take advantage of the economic opportunities created by the marketplace. They fought to get a toehold in the new economy, to try and produce products and goods more cheaply, sell them for a higher profit. And we start to see changes in the way that people work that are very familiar to us today. Traditionally, certainly in the colonial era, a skilled artisan was an independent man. He owned his tools, he owned his shop, he would make his goods, usually in a shop right next door to his house. He controls the pace of his work, the intensity of his work. But as the market expands, we see entrepreneurs, men who have money but no skill. We see them hire a bunch of craftsmen, put them together in large workshops, and overseeing their work. And sometimes the work would be subdivided. So like craftsmen who traditionally made an entire pair of shoes or a whole piece of furniture, now just made part of it. They're not independent in the way that they used to be because they're under somebody else's supervision. They're answering to somebody else. They're being paid by somebody else. They are, in a sense, dependent on somebody else. And with the work being broken down into steps, doing just one or two of the steps doesn't require as much skill or as much training as a skilled craftsman would have. Like making an entire pair of shoes requires a cobbler to have skill and artistry. But just cutting out pieces of leather for the shoes, that requires a pair of scissors. Sewing a couple of pieces together require a sturdy needle and thread, but not so much skill. This subdivision of labor had two major consequences that we are still seeing the effect of today. First, entrepreneurs don't need to hire so many skilled craftsmen. So they start hiring semi-skilled labor and paying them less. And so we see wages fall. Second, the work got really boring and repetitive, and workers had less sense of pride. I mean, it's one thing if you are a carpenter and you build you build an armoire, right, or a bureau, and you carve it and you put all the pieces together, and it's this beautiful, really crafted work of art. And you can point to that with pride and say, I made that bureau. But if you're working in one of these factories, you point to that piece of furniture and you say, I nailed the legs on that bureau. You know, less pride in that. And also way more boring to just be nailing legs onto a bureau all day. Now, in some industries, particularly in the textile industry, factories took over almost entirely. Factories would gather together huge groups of workers under centralized supervision and replaced the old hand tools with power-driven machines. Samuel Slater established America's first factory. It was called Slater's Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. He built it in 1790. Now, Samuel Slater was from Britain. He wanted to come to the United States and start a factory where he thought he could make a nice profit because America didn't have any yet. The problem was, Britain is where the Industrial Revolution began. They know that they have a technological superiority over any other Western European nation. They want to keep that superiority. So they made it illegal for anyone to take machine design plans or factory layout plans out of the country. So when Samuel Slater came to the United States, he had to memorize the blueprints for factories, the diagrams for different machines. He had to memorize all of that. And then once he got here, build those machines from his memory. And the most important machine that he memorized and built is this. It's called a spinning jenny. Traditionally, you want to make thread. One person sits at a spinning wheel, like in Sleeping Beauty, and you spin one spool of thread at a time. But with the spinning jenny, you can take these rovings of cotton or of wool down here in the bottom, and one person turns this crank, and on this one you can make a dozen spools of thread at a time. So that makes it much more efficient. Now, Slater's factories produced yarn, and then he would send the yarn out to traditional hand loom weavers and sometimes to farm women to be woven into cloth. That process, where you make part of it in a factory and then send part of it to skilled workers, that was called outwork. And that was really typical of early industrialization. You do what you can in the factory, like the simple stuff, but when you get to a part that requires real skill, send it out. Eventually, the entire manufacturing process will be brought under the factory roof. Now, the cutoff of British imports, because of the embargo and because of the War of 1812, was really good for American manufacturing. It stimulated a lot of American manufacturing. In particular, it helped to create the first large-scale American cotton mills. The first power-driven looms were built in 1814 in Massachusetts by a group of merchants who had pooled all of their money to build this one machine, and if it worked, they were going to share the profits. Within 6 years, they had made such profits that same group of merchants were able to build an entire factory town at Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell is considered kind of the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. These merchants built a group of factories, multiple factories, that brought together all of the steps of production. So they had a water wheel-driven spinning jenny that could actually make 30 spools of thread at one time. And then they had power-driven looms to weave the cloth. Then they had some machines that would finish the cloth off. By 1850, there were 52 mills at Lowell with more than 10,000 workers, all owned by this single group of entrepreneurs. And all across New England, small industrial cities were built along this pattern. Massachusetts soon became the second most industrialized region in the world after England itself. Now, Lowell was a factory town. And what a factory town is, you have all of these factories that are part of the same industry. And usually the factories are all owned by the same person or by the same corporation. And the company will not just build the factories, but they will own the housing, they will own the merchants, they might, if they feel like it, set up schools. And the people who live in that town are all people who work in these factories. At Lowell, most of the workers were young women, usually young unmarried women, although there were some widows with children, and the children usually also worked in the factories. Eventually, companies will start to build company towns that are even more controlling of their workers. Lowell was kind of an experiment, and the organizers at first were, I think, genuinely interested in bettering the young women who worked for them. Now, these early factories were set up along what they call fall lines. So they're near waterfalls, or they're near river rapids. They're near places where the water moves quickly, so you can harness the water power for spinning and weaving machines. But by the 1840s, we've got steam power, and that makes it possible to build factories away from the rivers. You start to see factories in the center of big cities. You don't have to move out to the riverside anymore. Now you can stay right in Philadelphia and work at a factory there. By the 1850s, factories produced, but not just textiles, but clocks and guns and shoes and farm equipment. Now, this system, this factory system, relied on often mass-producing interchangeable parts that could be quickly assembled into a finished product. So gunsmiths used to lovingly craft a single piece. But now in the factory system, they will mass produce triggers, and every trigger is identical and ought to fit onto any gun of that make. And it was, weirdly enough, Eli Whitney, the cotton gin guy, who created that technique in gun making. The spread of factories also meant that any small town could have a big mechanical capability. Any town could have a sawmill or a paper mill or an ironworks or all of that. Now, the early Industrial Revolution in the United States, though, was mostly confined to New England and a handful of cities in the middle colonies. The South really lagged behind. In general, the slave-owning classes of the South weren't that interested in industrialization. They felt like it was a waste of their time and money, and also it might end up taking power away from them. Now, the market revolution helped to change Americans' concept of time. Farm life, traditionally, was regulated by the rhythm of the seasons. But in cities, clocks became part of daily life, and work time and leisure time came to be clearly marked off from each other. You know, in the workshops, the artisan workshops in the colonial period, if you were a skilled craftsman, you might work really intensely for a while, and then if you got tired of it or bored with it, you could kick back and you could go down to the tavern and have a pint or go listen to a debate. But as the market revolution created more factory-based work, Americans' lives became increasingly tied to the clock. First, the factory workers themselves had to work for a set number of hours, and then it spread to the rest of society. Domestic servants worked by the clock, and then artisans in their own workshops. And the increasing reliance on railroads, which operated according to fixed schedules, that also made Americans much more conscious of doing things according to clock time. Although it won't be until the end of the century that railroads will push through their biggest change, the time zones. This type of work, under somebody else's supervision, working by someone else's clock, that didn't seem to be real freedom to a lot of folks. Some Americans did start to complain. They said that it wasn't true liberty for a man to work under somebody else's supervision, paid by somebody else, according to this clock. And for that reason, very few native-born men wanted to work in the early factories. So employers had to hire people who didn't have other choices. Sometimes factories would hire entire families, but most of them, especially the big ones in New England, the textile factories, they rely largely on female and child labor. At Lowell, young unmarried women from Yankee farm families dominated the workforce. To persuade parents to let their daughters leave home and go to work somewhere else with a bunch of strange men, Lowell owners would set up boarding houses with very strict rules about personal behavior. This is a timetable from the 1850s for the Lowell girls, and told you not just when you had to be at work and when quitting time was, but told you when you had to get up, when you would go to lunch, even what's going on your days off. And if you worked at Lowell, you had to live in the boarding houses, and there would be a house mother, essentially, who would oversee all of the girls who lived in her particular house. And she would make sure that they were up on time and go to sleep at times, at the right time. And she would also make sure that when the ladies were off the clock, when they were sitting down to dinner, that they were dressed properly. They had gloves on. And she would make sure that gentlemen callers did not get any further into the house than the formal sitting room. And she would usually chaperone when gentlemen were there to make sure that you don't sit too close together. And she would make sure that in your off hours, when you're not working, that you are doing something productive and not just sitting around getting into trouble. So at Lowell, there were lecture halls, and there were churches, and there was a magazine that all of the writers and the editors were the factory girls. And that was all set up so that these young women would have virtuous ways to spend their time. And that way the factory owners could tell their parents, look, we make sure that your daughters are being watched. We make sure that they're supervised and that they're not getting into any trouble. They're not going to disgrace themselves. They're making money and also they're learning stuff. But that constant supervision of workers' even private time seems impossibly restrictive from a modern point of view. But from the girls' perspective, this is the first time in history that large numbers of women left their homes to participate. Let me rephrase that. This is the first time in Western history that large numbers of girls are leaving their home to earn their own paycheck and participate in the public world. Now, women have always economically contributed to their families. That's not unusual. It's the leaving home part that's really unusual. Most of the girls that might chafe at some of the restrictions, but they like the opportunity to earn money at a time when there are very few respectable jobs outside the home that are open to women. Lucy Larcom was a Lowell girl, and she later wrote that she'd found her home life narrow and confining. But living and working at Lowell gave her a larger idea of womanhood, she said. It taught her that she could go out in the world and she could make a place for herself. But these girls were not intended to be permanent employees. They typically worked for only a few years, and then they went home and married. Like Larcom migrated out to Illinois, became a teacher and a writer. And because of this, there was constant turnover and shortage of labor in the factories until the U.S. started getting large-scale immigration in the 1840s. And by that point, the market revolution and westward expansion and all of these changes had produced a society that was kind of amazing to the people who lived in it and to European visitors who came to see it. It was very energetic. It was also very materialistic. It was kind of in constant motion. Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who toured the United States a number of times, and he wrote about being amazed by what he called the restless energy of Americans. He talked about their apparent lack of attachment to any one place. Their parents' and grandparents' generation would have been very settled people. Most of them would not have traveled would not have moved very far from their birthplace in the course of their life. But in this generation, everybody's on the move. And de Tocqueville said that they, hardly got to a new place before they decided that the grass was greener somewhere else, and then would pick up and move on again. And all of the changes of the early 1800s produced a really mobile population. Many people just didn't feel tied to the old communities anymore. They went where the pursuit of happiness took them, where it looked like the best opportunities were. Tocqueville wrote, "In the United States, a man builds a house in which to spend his old age and sells it before the roof is on. He plants a garden and leases it just as the trees are bearing." He said that Americans are just always on the move. Now, with any change in society, there has also got to be a change in the law to handle this new creation. And American law very much favored factory owners and entrepreneurs, the people who were building something in this new marketplace. But the law also usually protected those people from liability, from the consequences of their mistakes. And the corporation became central to this new market economy. A corporate firm has special privileges and powers that are granted in their charter from the government. And they have privileges and powers that more traditional forms of business do not. In particular, if there is a corporation, its investors and its directors are not personally liable for the company's debts or any damage caused by that company. Whereas if you run a company as an individual, or if you have a non-incorporated family farm and you accrue debt, the bank can not only crush your business, they can come after you personally. But if your business is incorporated, they can't. They can crush the business, yes, but not you yourself. And so investors began to very much prefer investing in corporations. If it fails, they lose the investment money, yeah, but they're not in personal danger. And because of that, corporations can raise a lot more money than traditional forms of business. And by the 1830s, many states had developed incorporation laws that would allow companies to get a corporate charter by filing some paperwork and paying a fee. Like today, it's super easy in Oklahoma. You can do it on the Secretary of State's website. But other Americans distrust corporate charters. They believe that a corporate charter is the government granting special privileges to people who were already wealthy and privileged. The fees that you had to pay to get the corporate charters put it out of the reach of an awful lot of traditional business owners. And so they see those people who can get the charters as people who had already benefited and now are getting this extra benefit. Overwhelmingly, though, the court system supported the corporations. They would often refuse to punish businesses for causing property damage or environmental damage. For example, if you have a paper mill and you want to harness water power, so you build a dam, you dam up a river to harness this water power, that can disrupt fishing and it can flood local farms. And back then, you didn't have to do an environmental impact study. You didn't even have to warn local property owners that you were going to build a dam. So all of a sudden, your neighbor walks out to check his corn and his field is underwater. And if he tries to sue you, the court's probably going to throw his case out. Folks also did a lot of environmental damage back then. We think of environmentalism as a modern thing, as something that kind of came about in the 1960s. But there were anti-pollution activists in the very early 1800s. Their particular issues were byproducts, like we'll use paper mills again. Paper mills caused a lot of pollution because of the chemicals that they used. As they used sulfur and they used bleach and other nasty things. And, oh God, until the 1950s, it was legal for them to dump the byproducts into rivers and lakes. So you never wanted to live downriver from a paper mill because it could get really, really nasty. And even today, you don't want to stand downwind from a paper mill because they still stink. The courts also said that employers had full authority in the workplace. They could even beat their employees. And the courts said that employees who tried to organize against that, who tried to form unions, were guilty of criminal conspiracy, and they could be thrown in jail. It wasn't until the 1840s that even a handful of states started to acknowledge that, you do have a First Amendment right to association and speech, which ought to protect your right to form a union. Just like changes in work and changes in timekeeping, changes in the law illustrate the idea that the market revolution is creating a complete revolution in American life. A westward expansion and this marketplace growth profoundly affected the lives of all Americans. And it reinforced some older ideas of freedom, but also helped to create some completely new ideas. For example, American freedom for a long time had been linked to land ownership, right? That's why so many Europeans came over here. Westward expansion got more land for white settlers. A New York journalist, John O'Sullivan, first used the phrase manifest destiny, meaning that the U.S. has not just the right to occupy all of North America, but the responsibility, has this divine mission to take over all of North America. O'Sullivan said that Americans, by which he meant white Americans, had a much better right to the West than anyone else did. And that manifest destiny, that obvious right, was a better claim than any treaty or any other discovery or even living here for 100,000 years could give to anyone. He said that the U.S. had a mission to expand freedom and democracy, and that gave the U.S. the right to that land over anybody else. And he said that the people who stood in the way, whether they were other nationalities or whether they were native people, were by definition obstacles to American progress. Now, O'Sullivan wrote that in the 1840s, but he's not the first person to think it. The idea had been kicking around for a long time. As the population moved west across the Appalachians, the link between expansion and freedom grew. The freedom to travel, the freedom to pick up and move where your opportunities might be better, became a more and more central element of American freedom. So we have that very traditional European idea of land ownership as the linchpin of freedom. But now we have this new element, this land ownership and the ability to travel and get land elsewhere, the ability to get more, to get different, to just try and find what works for you. This generation of Americans believed that the U.S. had been chosen by God for this great experiment to spread liberty. And they very much believed that westward expansion was a part and parcel of that destiny. The fact that spreading freedom for white Americans meant a loss of freedom and a loss of movement for other Americans and for non-citizens was not an issue that they dwelt on much. Now, in national myth and ideology, the West was seen as the last home of the freeborn American. In the West, land was much more easily available, it was much cheaper, and oppressive factory-style labor was much less common. With the population and the price of land back east rising, a young man's prospects for having his own farm and having his own shop really lay out west. The restless, competitive world of the market revolution also encouraged Americans to think of freedom as an absence of restraint, to think of it as the ability to develop themselves in the way that they, as individuals, want. Now, the opportunity for that personal growth and development, offered kind of a twist, like a reinforcement of Jefferson's pursuit of happiness idea. And it's one that is very well suited to a world where traditional boundaries are starting to disappear. Moving from place to place or from status to status were common features of American life. The philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in the 1830s that the people should find and trust their own individual definition of freedom. In Emerson's definition for himself, freedom was the process of self-improvement. It meant individuals remaking themselves, rebuilding their lives according to what they as individuals wanted. Emerson was one of the most prominent members of a group of New England intellectuals known as the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists, they're going to transcend the traditional rules of society. The Transcendentalists believed that individual judgment was more important than tradition or social institutions. They believed that society trying to push men into boxes and push their traditions on a person was the biggest threat to freedom. Now, there was some irony in this individualist ideal of the 1830s and 40s. Now, this idea said that Americans, especially men, should depend on no one but themselves. But the market revolution had made Americans much more closely connected to and dependent on each other and on the rest of the world. Now, trying to develop your personal independence is not a new idea. They've been talking about that since the 1700s. But those earlier philosophers, like Jefferson, believed that personal self-development ought to go hand in hand with self-sacrifice and public virtue and concern for the common good. This new generation of Americans are not that interested in civic virtue. They're starting to believe that the private realm is the most important, and it should not be interfered with, not by other people, not by the government. Now, that will eventually lead to an expansion of democracy, as the right to vote will eventually, based on these ideas of individualism, come to be linked to ownership of yourself, and not so much on ownership of property. Now, when he's an old man, looking back from like the 1880s, Emerson will talk about this era before the Civil War as a time when social existence, he said, gave way to the independence of the individual, who is driven to find his resources, his hopes, his reward, his society, and his God within himself. Now, the Transcendentalists, like Emerson and like Henry David Thoreau, believed that men should not, as Thoreau said, willingly enslave themselves. Believed that men were trapping themselves into tradition, into jobs, into places that they don't want to be by their obsession with wealth and status. And that is keeping men from really developing themselves. Now, to escape the awful fate of having a job and being socially responsible, Thoreau went off into the woods for a couple of years. He lived in a cabin on Walden Pond, which is near Concord, Massachusetts, so he could study the beauty of nature and enjoy being isolated from the tyranny of society. And then he wrote a book about it, criticized how the market revolution, in his view, was degrading American individualism and the value of individual people. Thoreau asked his readers to throw off the shackles of caring about wealth and find their freedom within. Now, we should keep in mind that Thoreau came from a fairly wealthy family, and he was privileged enough to leave whatever job he had whenever it started to bore him and feel fairly secure that he wouldn't starve. Now, Thoreau, I make fun of him a lot, but he did become fairly important by his support for different expressions of individualism. In particular, he supported civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is an individual non-violently protesting government policy based on what they, as an individual, believe. In Thoreau's case, he did not support the Mexican War. He didn't want his tax money going to support that war that he didn't believe in. So he refused to pay his taxes. And he willingly went to jail because of this. He only spent one night in jail because one of his aunts got really mortified that a member of her family was in a common jail, so she paid off his taxes for him. And he was kind of an ungrateful brat about that, too. But he wrote a great deal about civil disobedience, about the necessity of resisting unjust laws, and about the way that unjust laws stopped individuals from developing themselves as much as they can. His writings were read by really influential people much more recently, Gandhi and JFK and Martin Luther King. MLK read Thoreau while he was a college student like you. And later in his life, he said that he'd become convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good is. And he said that nobody had explained that to him as well as the writings of Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was also influential to modern environmentalists, and he and other transcendentalists usually supported the women's suffrage movement, because women ought to be able to develop themselves as individuals and have a voice. They usually were abolitionists, because transcendentalists believe that individuals have the right to walk their own path, and there is nothing more stifling to that than slavery. Now, even the religious revivals that we saw in the 1800s had a kind of individualist fervor. They're about self-improvement and self-reliance and self-determination. These revivals started, around the turn of the century-ish, and like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening revivals start out being organized by established churches that are upset about low church attendance. And just like the First Great Awakening, it will expand so far beyond what was originally intended. Only about 10% of white Americans were regular churchgoers in the 1790s and early 1800s. And so the older churches, traditional churches, you want to find a way to get people back in the pews. But the revivals very quickly spread beyond those churches. They peaked in the 1820s, 1830s. We see events like Reverend Charles Finney would hold literally months-long revival meetings in upstate New York. And he had actually been inspired to preach after going to a revival himself in the early 1820s. Like the First Great Awakening preachers, Finney and his brethren in this revival movement are also very theatrical. They warn of hell in very vivid language. They hold out the promise of salvation. Reverend Finney became really the first national celebrity. Everybody knew who he was. After he preached in Oneida County in upstate New York, one reporter said that the whole area had been completely overthrown by the Holy Ghost. He said that they'd shut down the theaters, they'd shut down the taverns, they were spending their time in holy pursuits. That lasted about a month, and then they restarted the taverns. But, for that month, they were really into this. The Second Great Awakening became truly a mass experience in a way that the first one couldn't be, because the first one just didn't have the technology. At the time of independence, there were fewer than 2,000 Christian ministers in the United States. By 1845, there are 40,000. Evangelical denominations, especially, like the Methodists and the Baptists, they have an explosive growth rate, and they had only just started to spread in the First Great Awakening. But after the second one, they're huge. By the 1840s, the Methodist Church had more than 1 million members, and it was the biggest denomination in the country. deism, the belief that the God doesn't really interfere, the one that kind of de-emphasizes going to church, that really began to fade away. Church membership became central to American identity. New religious movements and prophets began to appear regularly in the early 1800s. At the big camp revival meetings, especially on the frontier, you get these fiery revivalist preachers rejecting the idea that mankind is predestined. And again, that's something that the First Great Awakening had said and was extremely criticized for. In the Second Great Awakening, people have heard this idea for a couple of generations, and they're a lot more open to it now. The modern 20th and 21st century Protestant idea that salvation is by interfaith, that takes hold with an iron grip in the Second Great Awakening. Christianity was really practiced very differently in the United States before this period. The churches that the founding generation would have gone to were simply very much not the churches that they are today. The idea that anyone could be saved through grace in the 1700s was still considered a heresy. The belief that everyone has free will and everyone can be saved by grace really didn't take hold until this moment, didn't take hold in large numbers. And that attracted people who had been left out or who felt left out by traditional churches, women and poor people and slaves. Now, the First Great Awakening had stressed private judgment and thinking for yourself. The Second Great Awakening took that even further. Reverend Finney, in particular, said that every person was, and he used kind of a capitalist idea, so that every person was sort of this moral free agent, that you have these options that you can investigate. You can choose what kind of life you want to lead. And then you can change your mind later. Sinners can have a change of heart and then can come to God. And then, he said, you would be truly rational men. Revivalist ministers seized on all of the opportunities that the market revolution gave to them. Opportunities that, their forerunners just didn't have. So this generation can raise a lot of money. They can go on preaching tours using canals and steamboats and railroads, and they can flood the country with cheap, mass-produced religious tracts. Even the fact that all of the revivals were open to anyone, and people could choose to go or choose not to go, or go to like 15 different ones and then choose later which one they liked best, that resonated with the idea of market values. But evangelical preachers were not 100% cheerleaders for all of these changes that a market society had brought about. They do believe in individuals thinking for themselves. But they also warned that excessive individualism could hurt society. They railed against greed and indifference to others. Reverend Finney said that the extreme form of individualism is selfishness. And that, he said, is the law of Satan. But these revivals were extremely popular in precisely the areas that had been most changed by the market economy. I think most of Reverend Finney's converts came from the commercial classes along the Erie Canal, because evangelical ministers stressed the importance of hard work and sobriety and self-discipline. And those are exactly the qualities that are necessary for success in a market culture. Now, as the market revolution went on, the right to compete for economic status and goods and advancement became a part of the American idea of freedom. Henry Carey, not Harry Carey, the sportscaster, Henry Carey was probably the most prominent economist of the early 1800s. And he said that the whole question of whether or not a man is free was linked to economic competition and achievement. If you can't compete, you aren't free. The official government imagery like state seals and things like that, would often link the goddess of liberty with symbols of material wealth. Like New Jersey's state seal pairs the goddess of liberty with Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, because when New Jersey became a state, that was the symbol of prosperity. Later on, they added the motto liberty and prosperity. The state seal of Arkansas has a symbol of liberty atop an image of a steamboat and a plow, because when Arkansas became a state, that's what counted as prosperity. Many enterprising Americans seized on the different opportunities that the market revolution offered. John Jacob Astor was the son of a poor German butcher who immigrated to the U.S. at the end of the Revolution, and he earned huge profits in the early 1800s with the fur trade, shipping furs to China and then importing Chinese tea and silk. And Astor put his profits into real estate, bought up huge chunks of Manhattan Island. And when he died, he was the richest man in the United States. He had a fortune of about $10 million, which would be about $1 billion today. Men like Astor were seen as self-made men. The idea of the self-made man is someone who has succeeded without hereditary privilege, without government favoritism, without family wealth backing him up. A self-made man comes from nothing, does it through their own brains and their own hard work. But the self-made man isn't real. None of these men actually win it alone. State and federal and local governments built the roads and the canals and the railroads that they used to transport their goods. The U.S. Army protected their traders so that, for example, Astor could get his furs safely. Their contracts were protected and upheld by the courts. Their corporations were chartered by the state. Astor didn't stride off into the wilderness and then come back a millionaire. Now, Astor was way richer than any other allegedly self-made man of the time. But the market revolution and the growth of economic life did offer a lot of opportunities for particularly bankers and merchants and industrialists. It created a new middle class, this army of clerks and accountants and office workers. It did create new opportunities for farmers. But not every American was in a position to take advantage of these opportunities. Most African Americans, of course, were slaves. But even free black people were usually excluded from these new opportunities. There were 220,000-ish African Americans living in free states, but they still suffered discrimination in almost every part of their lives. Although nearly every northern county had some black residents, the majority of free black people lived in the poorest, unhealthiest sections of cities like New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and even in those northern cities, they were subject to occasional mob violence. Like in 1829, armed bands of white Ohioans roamed the black neighborhood in Cincinnati and burned homes and businesses to the ground. Black people, even in the North, were barred from most schools and most other public facilities. So free African Americans had to build their own institutions. Those tended to be based around education and around religion. Richard Allen was a Methodist preacher. He had a black Methodist preacher. And originally, he had been allowed to preach at an integrated church in Philadelphia. But as his congregation grew, the white church leaders put more restrictions on them. So now he's only allowed to preach the early Sunday services, and that is the only service that black people can attend. And then the church built a segregated gallery upstairs, and he could only preach the early Sunday service. That's the only one that black people could attend, and now they can only sit in that secluded upstairs gallery. And then they were no longer allowed to pray at the altar rail, and then they could no longer be baptized. So at that point, Richard Allen said, the nice, polite Christian version of F you, and left. And he founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, which still exists. Most white Americans believed that all of these market changes were giving them the chance to build up wealth and to advance in life. But most free African Americans experienced downward mobility during this era. And that was surprising to a lot of folks. We talked about in that generation right after the Revolution, from 76 to 1800, how northern states began that slow process of abolition. How even in the Upper South, even in Maryland and Virginia, there were voluntary manumissions. We saw the growth of a free community, and we saw at least a consideration of the idea that Black Americans could be treated as fully American citizens. But around the start of the 1800s, white folks start to retreat on that idea, the idea of an integrated citizenship. Even white folks up north are no longer willing to really address that idea. And so we see restrictions on Black people in the early 1800s that they didn't face a decade before. We talked about, because of the slow abolition up north, how the children of slaves in northern states became like the last generation of indentured servants. Most of those children had been owned by northern craftsmen, and so they learned significant artisan skills. They learned to be skilled coopers and skilled craftsmen and skilled blacksmiths. But by the time they were freed, the laws and the culture of northern states had changed so much that they have a very hard time using those skills, finding skilled work. Many white craftsmen in northern states criticize slavery, but they're not really enthusiastic about having free Black people around either. White craftsmen generally viewed free African Americans as competitors, as people who would drive down wages. And so they, by local custom or sometimes by law, do everything that they can to keep Black people out of good-paying, skilled jobs. And hostility from white craftsmen is only one of the many obstacles that kept Black people confined to the worst jobs. White employers didn't want to hire them for anything but the most menial work. White customers didn't want to be served by them. And the result was an almost free fall in economic status among the Black community. By the middle of the 1800s, that free community that had been thriving right after the Revolution was impoverished, working in unskilled jobs, working as domestic servants. The New York State Census in 1855 showed that New York City had 808 Black domestic servants and 1 Black lawyer. And free African Americans couldn't even take advantage of the westward push to improve their status because federal law barred them from buying public land. And by 1860, there were 4 northern states, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Oregon, that barred free Black people from entering their territory at all. White women also found a lot of opportunities closed off to them during the market revolution. Before this era, when goods were most often made at home, women had some economic value. Their labor had economic value and recognized and celebrated economic value. Women helped to make the products for sale. They certainly made most of the products for home use. But as production left the home and went to the factory, many women saw their traditional economic roles being undermined. They're no longer helping to bring in money. And if the family is buying its goods from the store instead of making it at home, then women are losing their power to save money as well. Now, some women followed the work as it moved from home to factory, but those tended to be young, unmarried women. Other women had to embrace a very new definition of womanhood, which did not value women's economic contribution and in many instances didn't even recognize that women could make an economic contribution. Instead, it glorified women as nurturers, as the only people who can create this peaceful haven from the messy outside world. They began to say, in a way that we hadn't really heard before, that women's place is only in the home. And in the home was increasingly emptied of economically productive work. A woman's role was supposed to build the things that didn't have economic value, like love and friendship. She's supposed to give her man shelter from the competitive marketplace. Now, this is very different than what we had before. I know that what I just said, this cult of domesticity and the woman's place is in the home, that's what we often assume has always been the traditional view of women, but it's not. We talked about the women of the revolutionary generation. They've got this Republican motherhood idea. That had allowed women to have a public role as the mothers of future citizens. It had insisted that women ought to be informed and educated. But in the early 1800s, we lose that. And in its place, we get what women of this era called the cult of domesticity. Back for revolutionary women, virtue was civic virtue. It was that political thing. It was being involved in the political process and working together as a part of society to build something better. But in this era, virtue lost that civic quality. It came to mean some kind of personal, moral quality, and it was increasingly associated only with women. Virtue meant sexual innocence and frailty and dependence and obedience. There was a very popular magazine in the 1820s and 1830s called The Young Lady's Book, and they wrote a whole lot of stuff. But in one issue, its editor wrote that in whatever situation of life, a spirit of obedience and submission and pliability are required of women. Later, it carried an article called Woman, a Source of Comfort, and my very favorite, Woman, Man's Best Friend. With more and more men leaving home for work, women did exercise a little power over personal matters inside the family. We saw a rapid decline in the birth rate during the 1800s. At the start of the century, a woman would bear an average of 7 children. By the end of the century, a woman would bear an average of 4 children. And we can't explain that except as the conscious decision of millions of women to limit the number of children they had. But even with that internal household decision-making power, the cult of domesticity limited women's participation in the world. Men were supposed to be rational and aggressive and domineering, and therefore they had a place in public. Women were supposed to be nurturing and selfless and irrational, and therefore not fit for public life. Men throughout the century argued against being submissive to another person. They said that infringed on their freedom. But they demanded exactly that of their wives. Men could move freely between the public and the private realm, but women were supposed to remain cloistered in the female sphere of the home and the family. Now, this new definition of womanhood is absolutely useless to a large number of women. Poor women and working class women had to work for wages, at least at some point in their lives. They worked despite severe disadvantages. They could not compete freely for jobs. Only the lowest paying are open to them. Married women still could not sign their own labor contracts. Their husbands had to sign for them. They couldn't sue in their own names. They didn't control their wages until after the Civil War. But still, if your family's poor, you got to bring in money. Everybody's labor is necessary to keep the family afloat. Thousands of poor women worked as domestic servants and factory workers and seamstresses, although in many cases, seamstress was a euphemism for sex worker. Early industrialization had allowed women to be part of that outwork system, which let them stay in the home, in the female sphere, but still contribute to the family income. But as the 1800s go on and the outwork system dies off, we see a real division between who can uphold this definition of respectable, decent womanhood and who can't. And generally, if your family's poor, you can't. But that can do a number on your psyche. Now, if you are told by everything in society that this is the definition of what a good woman is, what a real woman is, and you know you can't do that, then what are you? For the expanding middle class, it became a badge of respectability for wives to stay at home outside of the ugly, disorderly marketplace economy. Husbands increasingly went to work outside the home, in offices and shops and factories. In large cities, the new middle class began to build their own fashionable neighborhoods, which also kind of cut women off from the public world. Work in middle-class homes was done by domestic servants, not by the lady and the daughters of the house. And so the freedom of middle-class women to uphold the definition of real womanhood rested on the inability of other women in their home to live that way. Now, even in middle-class homes, most women were not idle. They still did stuff. But in the market economy, work came to mean something that brings in money. And in some ways, we still kind of think of it like that way. Like, how often have you heard somebody say about a stay-at-home mom, oh, she doesn't work, she's a stay-at-home mom? Like, that's work, and that's hard work. But we still have this idea that work is something that pays. And because of that, work came to be seen as something that only men did. Lydia Maria Child was a woman who was trying to navigate these changes in her life. She wrote a book called The Frugal Housewife. It was published in the 1820s, and it was about how to prepare girls for what's expected of them as wives. And so there's stuff on cooking and on housekeeping. There's a chapter on how to direct domestic servants, but there's also a chapter on, it's titled How to Endure Poverty. Lydia Maria Child supported her family financially through this writing. But she also did other things that were really financially advantageous for her family, but didn't count as work. Like, she kept a household diary of the stuff that she did around the house, and in 1 year, she made 36 pieces of clothing. She prepared more than 700 meals. All of those things had a financial benefit to her family because it was helping them save money. So by any reasonable definition, even when she wasn't writing and bringing in income, she still worked. But discussions of labor rarely mentioned housewives, or even domestic servants, or female outworkers, unless they were being criticized for, limiting their husband's earning power or degrading men. The idea that a male head of household should earn a family wage, enough money to let him support a wife and children, that became a very popular idea during this era, so that women could stay at home where they're supposed to be. Advocates of the family wage complained that the new market economy was tearing women away from their roles as happy wives and forcing them into the labor market. They said that undermined the power of their husbands. Now, as that complaint suggests, some Americans did feel threatened by the changes in the marketplace. But some older Americans, like really the old members of the Revolutionary generation, they are deeply suspicious of these changes. They're afraid that this obsession with personal gain is hurting the public good. Like John Adams, former president, warned that commerce and luxury and greed are destroying our government. In the 1820s, Thomas Jefferson turned into one of those old men who write cranky letters to the editor. But he's writing to younger congressmen. At least once a week, he's writing a letter talking about the bankers and the speculators and everybody who's leading the U.S. away from his idea of this ideal yeoman farmer. And it's true that many Americans experienced the market revolution as a loss of freedom. The period between the War of 1812 and about 1840 saw a sharp economic downturn in 1819, a full-fledged depression that started in 1837, and a roller coaster of ups and downs in between. Jobs were often hard to find, and many businesses failed. For every person who rode the tide of progress, another one seemed to sink beneath the waves. The economic transformation did bring up the general standard of living, but especially in the cities of the Northeast, it also widened the gap between the wealthy merchants and factory owners on one hand, and their increasingly impoverished workers on the other. In Massachusetts, which was the most industrialized state in the country, the richest 5% controlled more than half the wealth. The inequality was even worse in Philadelphia, where the top 1% had more wealth than the bottom 99% combined. Bankruptcy was common. Debtors' prisons were always full. People were alarmed at the loss of traditional skills and at the threat of becoming dependent wage earners. And now it's not just a fear that you will have to answer to somebody else. It's the fear that if you are a dependent wage earner, you could lose that job. Skilled craftsmen, starting in about the late 1820s, created the world's first working men's parties. They tried to mobilize support for shorter working hours. They wanted a 10-hour maximum day, and the right to form unions and safer working conditions. But they also talked about things like ending the debtors' prisons and free public education. They saw that an education would be a way to make sure that their children didn't have to struggle the way that they are. In the 1830s, which is a time of massive economic unrest, unions became much more popular, strikes became pretty common, and along with demands for higher wages and shorter hours, the early labor movement also called for things like free homesteads for settlers. Now, the reason why they want that, because I know it sounds a little weird, why do factory workers care about farmers heading west? The reason they care about that is there's actually a couple of reasons. One, if the government gives free homesteads to settlers and people move out west, that means there's less competition for jobs in the east. So wages ought to go up. Workers ought to have a little more of a platform. Their bosses ought to have, a little less of a threat hanging over the worker's head. And also, if those folks head west and start farming, they're going to need plows and reapers and chemical fertilizers and all of the things that factory workers make. So, if the government gives free homesteads away, you as a factory worker ought to see less competition for your job, higher wages, and more demand for the products that you make. Plus cheaper food, because now there's more farmers. So they're really thinking not just for themselves, but also in a way, that can sort of benefit the whole country there. But over and above those specific, economic demands, workers were calling on older ideas of freedom. They want economic freedom. They want civic virtue. They want social equality. In 1835, 20 tailors in New York were convicted of criminal conspiracy for trying to form a union. And that was not unusual. But for some reason, that conviction sparked a public protest. And just like colonists had done in the run-up to revolution, these protesters had a mock burial for liberty. And these protests are not confined just to men either. The young mill girls in Lowell, Massachusetts, walked off their job in 1834 to protest a wage cut. And then 2 years later, they went on strike again when the bosses raised the rent at the boarding houses. And they carried banners calling themselves the daughters of free men and saying that the factory owners wanted to make them slaves. They pointed out that the dictionary, Noah Webster's dictionary, said that freedom meant being exempt from the control of another person. And the Lowell women And eventually other workers asked, by that definition, how many people are truly free? Now, some labor leaders went way too far in their rhetoric. Some of them tried to say that working for wages was actually the same thing as slavery because it made people dependent on their employer like slaves were. Most of them wouldn't go that far, though. Most of them tried to keep the crazy dial down. But in this era of such emphasis on the individual, on self-reliance, working men's parties began to question whether that is truly a realistic way to build a society, whether that's the best response to the kind of inequality that is growing. They said that maybe workers' problems aren't individual problems. Maybe they're institutional problems. Maybe it's a problem in society. They began asking for a radical rethinking of our social and economic arrangements. And so in these early labor protests, we see a very tentative beginning of what will eventually become the demand for an American standard of living. Now, that won't fully flower until the early 1800s, but we can absolutely see the seeds of it here. Now, the market revolution is intimately connected with a third central element of American freedom, and that is political democracy. But we're going to stop the lecture here and talk about the democratic aspect of it in the second half of the video.